You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 12th of November 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio 2 here at Midori House in London. I'm Vincent McAviney. Coming up on today's programme, as Donald Trump's administration and cabinet begins to take shape, what can we glean on foreign policy from his rumoured Secretary of State pick? Then to Peru, where Pacific leaders are gathering.
That's right, Vincent. At least 14 leaders of the world have so far confirmed their attendance at the Leaders Summit in Lima from November 15 to 16. China's Xi Jinping, Japan's new Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru, Canada's Justin Trudeau, all the big ones are going to be there.
And we check in on the Paris Photo International Photography Fair.
Is a physical archive like Magnum has over almost 80 years of practice still existing in 10, 15, 20 years.
Plus a roundup of the day's business news. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Vincent McAviney. Now, Donald Trump has made some staffing appointments in the week since the election, as vying candidates ensconce themselves in Mar-a-Lago, hoping to win favour. But after an exhausting few years of campaigning, Trump has been unusually low profile with his pronouncements and appearances. Governments and analysts around the world are, though, waking up this morning to pore over the record of rumoured pick for Secretary of State, Florida Senator Marco Rubio. He is expected to become America's chief diplomat, quite a journey for a politician who previously called the president-elect a third-world strongman and a con artist who should never be in charge of the nuclear codes. Well, Scott Lucas, adjunct professor at the Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin, joins us now to discuss the prospective appointment. Scott, if true, what can you tell us about Marco Rubio?
Well, first of all, one caveat. Although Rubio is favored through the leaks to become Secretary of State, it may not come off. Do remember that 4 years ago, Donald Trump was tipping everyone off that the Republican Senator Mitt Romney would be the Secretary of State. And then after Romney effectively interviewed for the job with Trump, Trump humiliated him by not naming him. So, we're not there yet. But if he goes for Rubio, what you're talking about is, again, another senator. Rubio's 53. He's been in the U.S. Senate since 2010. He ran for president in 2016, where he made certain comments about Trump that were not favorable, as you mentioned in your introduction. He was considered for Trump's running mate this year, but in the end, that went to J.D. Vance. And now, of course, the idea is that you tap him to be the chief diplomat in what appears to be a pattern where Trump is pulling people in from the legislature. We'll discuss other appointments in a minute, with the idea that it's those people who are more likely to be loyal to him and that will bend the knee to him than those who have served in, say, the civil service or who have been even in Republican think tanks.
And it would create a problem for Trump, though, because Rubio would have to sort of renege his Senate seat, and they've got a sort of tight majority there, so that would be one issue. But let's sort of unpick what we know about his foreign policy positions. First of all, Ukraine. What's his record like on this?
Well, Rubio initially had been fairly firm in terms of providing support for Ukraine against that Russian invasion, which is now in its 33rd month. But he has begun shifting this year, and importantly, in the last few weeks, he's become sound very Trumpist in his statements, such as the idea that maybe Ukraine should not continue to receive the aid from the United States that it has been getting to enable it to maintain its resistance, or there would be very strict conditions on that. So I think you're probably looking at Rubio bending the knee to Trump and to J.D. Vance if they decide to go ahead and cut off the aid to Ukraine, and to also effectively bend the knee to allow Russia to hold on to those areas that it has seized since 2022.
Turning to the Israel situation and what's going on in Gaza and with the Palestinians, I mean, he's a pretty staunch ally of Israel, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, Israeli papers are hailing this decision today as one of theirs, effectively. And the easiest thing to read about Trump's foreign policy as chaotic and inconsistent as it can be, is that it will be all-out support of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, who is maintaining and possibly expanding his war in Gaza and Lebanon. And that's because Trump told Netanyahu a few weeks ago in a phone call, Bibi, do what you have to do. So as much as you could criticize the Biden administration for not being able to contain Netanyahu, at least they tried to put some pressure on him. That's gone once the Trump administration takes office.
Yeah, the guardrails would really be off then. Continuing our globe trot. Now, Marco Rubio is a Cuban American, and as mentioned, he comes from Florida, where that is there are very much concerns of voters there, the Latino and Hispanic community, about the situation in Cuba. What do we know about his approach? Because Obama had tried to, take down the embargo to bolster ties. Trump put that back up. Not much has happened in sort of the Biden presidency on that front. What do you think that could spell for the island?
No, it's the ongoing Cold War that continued even after the bigger Cold War has ended. We're now getting into 65 years of that U.S. embargo. The Biden administration didn't even want to risk political blowback by trying to pull back some of the measures, such as Obama did. On the other hand, Cuba's kind of an issue which is strange, that apart from the Cuban American community, you hear very little about it in U.S. politics. So I suspect that Cuba will be on the back pages, although you will see other countries, and this is where it will be important, like Russia and China, continue to court Cuba as part of an alternative bloc to that which includes the United States.
And you've led me on there to our final stop on this geopolitical world tour. China, he's pretty much a China hawk, isn't he?
Yeah, he's from China hawk. And I got to be honest with you, it doesn't really matter if you're Democrat or Republican. The vast majority of people in D.C. now are China hawks. The Trump tariffs, as haphazard as they were, most of them have stayed in place under the Biden administration and have been put in fact, on a more formal basis. I think the question is going to come is if Trump decides to expand those tariffs, which will cause economic damage to the United States, or let's say it gets very haphazard and there's threats exchanged over Taiwan, will Rubio maintain that support of Trump if Trump risks getting America into an all-out confrontation, if you want to call it that, with the Chinese.
And turning now to some of the other appointments, Reuters is reporting that Republican Representative Mike Waltz will be the national security advisor, according to sources. What's his record like?
Well, Waltz was actually more of a traditional conservative Republican, but again, in recent months, he's shifted to sort of take more of the Trumpist tone. That's been especially true with Ukraine. He supported aid to Ukraine even up to the point where it passed in April after a blockade by the Trumpists. But now he's talking about that Europe should take the lead in aid, that the United States should take a step back. Again, just reiterating those lines that Trump has talked about, albeit going farther by saying that Vladimir Zelensky is ripping off the United States. Waltz is also a China hawk, very firm China hawk, as is Marco Rubio. But I think the broader thing, as we talk about Waltz and possibly move on to Elise Stefanik at the UN, is that the Trump team are demanding absolute loyalty from folks. So in other words, if they took positions that differed from Trump in the past, they give them up. And that is why you've seen two names that were ruled out from high-level positions. And that's the former UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, and the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo.
Yeah, and talking of the ambassador to the UN, we have a name, Elise Stefanik, who's a congresswoman, sort of made a name for herself in congressional hearings earlier this year, taking down the heads of various universities over anti-Semitism on campus. And it sounds like she is heading to the UN headquarters.
Yeah, and Elise Stefanik is very smart, and she's very ambitious. She used to be a moderate Republican. She saw which way the winds were blowing in the party, and she turned herself into a diehard Trumpist. She sought out photo opportunities, like the one you talked about, where she whipped up this specter of anti-Semitism to get the college presidents effectively tarred and feathered in public. Two of them eventually sacked. And I think what you're going to see is she's going to take up positions for the cameras, which are going to sound very, very hawkish in Trump terms. That is, if Trump wants to go after China, they go after China. If Trump wants to support Israel in expanding the war against Gaza or possibly against Iran, Stefanik backs that point of view as well. In other words, there's going to be no emphasis on diplomacy in the UN from Stefanik. It's going to be more on those Trumpist lines, which are, you follow us or we consider you to be an opponent who we will take down.
Well, we will all continue watching the comings and goings at Trump's Mar-a-Lago club to see who's hired and who's fired. Scott Lucas, adjunct professor at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, thank you very much. Now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Vincent. North Korea has ratified its mutual defense treaty with Russia. Military cooperation between the two nations has been on the rise, with North Korean troops being deployed in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Philippines Defense Secretary says China is ramping up pressure on his country to cede its sovereign rights in the South China Sea. The claim comes amid meetings between Manila and Australia as the two countries continue to grow security ties. And the oil and gas giant Shell has won its appeal against a landmark Dutch climate ruling. The original 2021 judgment had ordered Shell to reduce its carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Vincent.
Thanks, Laura. Now, Pacific leaders are gathering in Lima this week for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference. Apec was established 35 years ago in an attempt to bind Pacific region economies and foster cooperative trade. Chinese Premier Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden will both be attending ahead of the G20 in Brazil next week. Oscar Guardiola Rivera, writer and professor of international law and human rights at Birkbeck College in the University of London, joins us now. Oscar, what can we expect from the meeting?
It's going to be a very interesting meeting. As you pointed out, all the big leaders are going to be there. And of course, it is happening, a week after Trump's election. That changes everything. Everybody's going to see how the different leaders, but particularly Xi Jinping from China, begins to respond to the news that Trump is back in the White House.
And of course, at the forefront of everyone's minds, tariffs. What kind of signals are we looking for in the reaction from the leaders there?
We've heard from Trump that he plans to slap tariffs between 10 and 20%, even 60% in the case of China. And that's, of course, the big thing. Xi Jinping is going to be in Peru, and before he arrived there, the Xinhua Institute, which is the biggest think tank parallel to a media corporation in China, issued its report on the Belt and Road Initiative in the Americas. So we're expecting a big boost of China's presence in Latin America, which is already pretty considerable. So Xi Jinping is going to be there in Peru doing that. There are two initiatives which are key. One of them is a huge port. We're going to talk about it, I'm sure, later on. And then there are various initiatives regarding technology, biotechnology, and so on, which are being heralded in Peru, but also in Brazil as the next big thing for the region. So to sum up, we're going to see Latin America beginning to reaffirm its drift towards China, particularly now that Trump's threatening these measures.
Well, let's look at, the Belt and Road Initiative. Countries, obviously, they get infrastructure of varying qualities, but they have to make huge concessions, to China, ceding, sovereignty, giving them areas for their own sort of ports and bases, all that sort of stuff. What's been the experience like of South American countries dealing with China on all of this?
Well, let's begin with Peru, which is perhaps the main partner here. Xi Jinping, as I pointed out, is set to inaugurate a new Chinese-backed megaport in Chancay, some 80 kilometers from Lima. In the case of Peru, the situation is a bit different because, listeners may not know this, but Peru-China relations go back to the 19th century. there is a considerable community of Chinese people in Peru who have been there since then. And it is precisely because of those ties, those common cultural ties. The Chinese culture is pretty influential in Peru and has been for a while. The relations between the two countries, therefore, are amicable. And the view from most other countries, particularly Peru and Brazil, the next big partner of China, is favorable. You do not tend to see the kinds of deals that you mentioned, which are more often seen in African countries. You do not tend to see that in South America. In fact, the view from South America is that, on the one hand, at least in part, China's economic policy has a lot to do with what Latin America tried to do back in the 70s. There is mutual inspiration. This is another story that is not well known. And so China is not seen as an anomaly. Rather, China succeeded in doing what Latin America wanted to do in the 1970s. In that regard, the firm investment, the fact that Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil, leads the BRICS Development Bank and so on, tells us that these relationships are being cultivated on an equal basis.
And, I mean, the other conversation that's going to be had is climate change, particularly, with Brazil and the Amazon. But elsewhere, on the other side of the world in Baku, there's a meeting ostensibly going on, the COP29, which is meant to be all about climate change. But all of these leaders have skipped it. Do you think this was a mistake in the scheduling, or is it just that this is the more important meeting right now?
I guess that's a symptom. This is the more important meeting right now, but it's also a symptom of, the sort of the fact that we're not taking seriously the battle against climate change. I mean, in fact, only a few weeks ago, we had COP16, the biodiversity meeting happening in Colombia. Not many leaders made it there. In fact, the results, important though they may have been, were lackluster. And that is very much the feeling vis-a-vis COP29. I mean, for most leaders, the comeback of Trump kind of, seals the deal, if you like. And that's going to be problematic. It is very problematic for countries in Latin America, particularly for Brazil. We all saw the wildfires just a month ago over there. And so much more needs to be done there. But you're right, the important meeting is the one in Lima.
And finally, sort of tariffs aside, what is the view from sort of South American ordinary citizens in countries of Donald Trump? Because we know that Trump did very well with Latin and Hispanic voters in the United States. And particularly thinking about Brazil, you've got Jair Bolsonaro, thought that, he's already signaled he thinks that he can score this kind of comeback. What are electorates feeling?
Yeah, well, let's begin with the statement. Trump did very well. He didn't do that well with Latino voters. He did better than he had done in 2016. He has done better, particularly with Latino men. That's very, very important because you will not see that happening in Latin American countries. The view about Trump in Latin America changes from country to country. Mexico is worried. Mexico is very likely to be hit hard, the hardest perhaps, if, in 2026 we're going to see renegotiations of the free trade agreement. And Trump has been very, very clear that he wants the trade relationship, which is favorable to Mexico, to change. So that's going to be an issue. There are concerns there. Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, has said, "Look, we have nothing to worry in any case." So that's worrying there. But if you go to, say, Argentina, well, Milei supporters are jubilant. In the case of Venezuela, for instance, an interesting contrast. My bet there is that, unlike most people think, we're not going to see much hostility towards Venezuela. On the one hand, because Trump needs to keep oil prices low in the United States. On the other hand, because of immigration. And of course, these are the two big themes: energy, immigration. Immigration, well, a lot of it is coming from Venezuela. Venezuela. So Trump is transactional. So you can bet there will be a transaction. Look, if you take back these thousands of Venezuelan migrants, we will ease the measures. And ditto for Colombia. The U.S. needs Colombia to forestall immigration, but also to keep drug trafficking under check. And we'll see, of course, what happens with Cuba.
Oscar Guardiola Rivera, thank you. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Let's get a roundup now of some of the day's business stories with Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Ewan, a week on from presidential elections, how are markets pricing Donald Trump's win?
Hello, Vincent. They call it the Trump trade. It's been a thing all year for investors who wanted to bet on a win for the former president. And as you might expect, it has been turbocharged in the past week. Stocks up, cryptocurrencies up, the dollar up, but with bonds selling off. The basic bet is that the Trump presidency will be good for US economic growth and therefore good for companies and the stock market. Some signs of a pause today. There's been a sell-off in Asia, partly over concerns of some of Donald Trump's early appointments. They're looking pretty hawkish on China, and futures pointing to a slightly negative open in the US later on today. But up to now, it has been quite the run for the US stock market. The S&P 500 closing yesterday at another record high. It's actually the 51st record high of the year. So this has been going on before the election result. Markets up about 5% over the last 5 trading sessions. That is a big gain for the world's biggest stock market. The dollar index, the Bloomberg dollar index, hitting a 1-year high yesterday. Ironically, making US exports less competitive and making imports cheaper for American consumers. A bit of a problem for the new president. It's not been looking quite so nice for bondholders, though. US Treasuries have been selling off. Of course, if you're a bondholder, the last thing you want is inflation. And there's a big debate at the moment about how inflationary some of Donald Trump's policy proposals will be. Several things could add to inflation. His immigration crackdowns could tighten the labour market further. Tariffs, of course, are generally inflationary. You're adding to the cost of goods coming from abroad. If he adds a 10% tariff to everything coming from abroad, that will undoubtedly be inflationary. And, of course, big tax cuts coming at a time when the US is already running a very large trade deficit, a very large government deficit, I should say. That is also a worry for the bond market, which, of course, have got to fund all of this borrowing. So lots of questions over the agenda.
There are some quite hilarious videos doing the rounds on social media of Trump supporters having how tariffs work actually explained to them and having confused the idea that it was the other countries that had to pay and not US companies and in turn US citizens for importing goods. Well worth a watch. And plenty of hype around Bitcoin, which hit a record high earlier today.
Yeah, the world's biggest cryptocurrency has been turbocharged by the election result. Bitcoin gaining more than 30% since last Tuesday, hitting a record high earlier today, just above $89,500. The rally, you might call it a feeding frenzy, has lifted the overall value of the crypto market above its pandemic era peak. You remember back in the pandemic, people had lots of money to spend and nothing to spend it on, and they put a lot of money into crypto. So there was that massive boom back then. Well, we're now above that peak. The total value of the crypto market, Bitcoin included, is now above $3 trillion. Trump has vowed friendlier crypto rules, and with the Republican Party tightening its grip on Congress, that's seen as boosting the odds of getting that agenda through. The president-elect has vowed to remove the chairman of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, Gary Gensler. He's taken a tough line on crypto regulation, so the industry will be pleased to see the back of him. And Trump's other pledges include setting up a strategic Bitcoin stockpile and fostering domestic mining of the token to make the US the crypto capital of the planet. How much of this, though, is driven by this news and how much is driven by momentum and FOMO, basically, I think is really the question. Many investors are betting that Bitcoin could reach $100,000 by the end of the year. That would be a gain of about 13% from where we are now. But if you think this is an easy way to make money, then take the warning that it's basically like the Wild West. And that's just talking about Bitcoin, which of course is the biggest and most stable of the cryptocurrencies. There's a whole mountain of these cryptocurrencies just launched in the last couple of weeks: Happy Cat, Melon Dog, and Tux the Penguin. So I suggest you don't put all of your pension in those, Vincent.
Yeah, tech magic beans, really, and with a huge carbon footprint as well for all that mining. Ewan Potts, Bloomberg reporter, thank you very much. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, Magnum Photos is arguably the most legendary photo agency in the world. And soon a selection of the most iconic images from its archives will be exhibited at the Photo Arsenal Wein art gallery in Vienna under the title Magnum, A World of Photography, to coincide with the opening of the centre's new location in March 2025. Arts journalist Amma Rose Abrams met with the centre's creative director Felix Hoffmann, who organised a series of talks at Paris Photo ahead of the exhibition, and began by asking what he hopes to explore by digging into the Magnum archive.
We are digging into the question of archival practices related to the agency Magnum Photos. Magnum Photos has the fantastic historically tradition coming from 20th century, founded in 1947. And this tradition is now reflected with contemporary aspects, what we try to reflect with several artists like Susan Masella, Spieke de Porta, and Raphael Milach. And this is a good opportunity here in Paris to do this.
Because the audience is all here for Paris Photo.
Exactly, and we are in Vienna,
Yes.
And nobody knows us. And it's much better to come to the place where actually the party is. And this is once a year in Paris.
And then they can follow you to the show in Vienna. But what was it that made you want to do this show? I mean, Magnum Archive, I'm sure we would all love to have a dig around in that. But why the archive? Why that subject now?
I think there are since 10, 15 years plopping up more and more questions how we deal with archival practices in our digital age. And the question is a physical archive like Magnum has over almost 80 years of practice still existing in 10, 15, 20 years? And what is the shift with this archive? And my experience is, there is a lot of loss or change or shape in these archival practices. And for me, it's maybe the last or the right or a good moment to dig into this archive and to bring it up again.
And there's a big interest in photography at the moment. I mean, it's so popular with audiences, but I feel at moments it kind of branches out of the photography world, which can be quite insular and connects very strongly. And we seem to be in one of these moments now. How are you finding Paris Photo this week? How have you found the atmosphere?
There are several layers in your question now, because photography is a cultural practice. We all deal with this. We all have so many pictures in our pockets. And an institution like Photo Arsenal in Vienna is dealing with all these questions around fake news and responsibility, dealing with visual culture and visual systems. And a part of this visual system is the market system here at the Paris Photo. And of course, Paris Photo is a fair, but it brings up much more questions. And this is the interesting situation, what we have here, because we have interesting exhibitions, we have an art fair where you can buy things, and there's a lot of dialogue. And this dialogue creates more in our mind when we meet each other. And this is a meeting point, a big meeting point, and this is why I'm always coming to Paris. So coming back to your question, there are some fantastic pieces at the fair. I found several archives at the fair, like a new archive out of the structure of Helen Levitt, a US-American photographer, very early taking pictures with color. And as well, a fantastic curated exhibition by a colleague between Paris and Berlin living about Lithuanian photography, never brought on display here in Paris. So there are these kind of small stones you cannot see so widely as you can find it here in Paris.
Absolutely. And are there any trends you've spotted?
That's very hard to say, because there are these, I would say, revelations. As well, we are now coming back to archival strategies, things we would never had recognized 10 or 15 years ago. You know, one aspect is that young photographers are now going into archives like the archive of Richard Avedon. Tyler Mitchell did this for the Gagosian Gallery. And this is something I'm really surprised that someone like a young artist, 29 years old, has the opportunity to deal with such a famous photographer. You know, the core or the fundament of this Paris Photo experience every year is you start with a single experience. Sometimes you find only one picture, one image framed on the wall in a booth of a gallery, and then you start with the research, and then you dig deeper. And that is my great pleasure here in Paris every year.
That was Amma Rose Abrams. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Anita Riota. Our researchers were Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Jumani. And our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Vincent McAviney. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.